Hello, I've got for you today something slightly different. I'll be comparing the writing samples of these four pens on about a dozen different types of paper. So from right to left we've got a $700 Montblanc Classique, sort of the cheapest you can go with a Montblanc Fountain pen. The new calligraphy pen at about twice the price, about 1,400 Canadian dollars, Singapore dollars, Australian dollars, and then this is a Masters of Meisterstruck L'Aubrac at about $3,200, and then on the far left, this is a limited edition 888 Hommage de Scipione Borghese at about $12,700. So you've got a $12,000 range in price difference between the lowest pen and the highest pen we're going to test today. So to do the tests, I've got a number of sheets prepared for you from various sources. We've got, first of all, Montblanc's Indigo collection. It's basically just a off-the-shelf notepad from Montblanc. Clairfontaine paper, 90 grams per square meter, produced in France. Rhodia's vellum paper, a sheet from Moleskine classic notebook, made in China. Xerox generic copy paper. This is the stuff that you find in the office, just for the sake of comparison. And then I've got some Dollar Rower smooth heavyweight. So this is 200 grams per square meter, made in France. And for fun of it, I've pulled some sheets of paper out of my archive. So this is watercolor paper. It's about more than 15, maybe 20 years old. 200 grams, made in Canada. And then here's some Japanese tracing paper, quite thin. Then some semi-gloss poster paper, 250 grams, made in China. And then for the fun of it, I've also got this sheet of birch bark. Birch bark is quite interesting in that it feels sort of like it's got a texture of almost talcum powder, but in fact if you treat it properly you can extract oil from it. So it doesn't absorb water particularly quickly. So I've primed the pens with, with simply generic blue ink. Blue Montblanc ink, except for the calligraphy pen that's already been primed with black ink, and I'm using that every day. So all these pens, with the exception of the really expensive limited edition one, are my daily carries. So I'm quite used to working with them. But you'll forgive me, I've got a tripod between me and the sheets of paper, so we'll see how well this goes. So let's see. Let's just make sure we've got everything in focus. See that well enough, I think. Yeah. So let's begin. So this is the Montblanc Indigo, and this is the Classique. So I'll make a notation on each page and then compare them later. Forgive my penmanship, I'm trying to be consistent but also relatively expedient. So this Classique nib is a medium nib. All my nibs, with the exception of one, are medium. And finally the birch bark. Okay, so we'll put that away. Sheets may take a moment to dry, but we'll start off with the let's see. So this is the flex nib. Now, I guess it's fair to say that I haven't been using the flex nib as it's intended. I'm not using it to make calligraphy lines. I'm simply using it to apply the same amount of pressure that I have on all pens. This is the first time that I'm doing this, so I'm quite curious actually to see how all of this turns out. After some of the comments you left on the page with respect to the use of generic copy paper, which I found always passable, I was curious to know how much better fountain pen paper would be performing in comparison. And I have maintained throughout all these various videos that the quality of nib and the effect that you're going to get is pretty much standard. So even if you're paying $12,000 for the nib or for the pen, I don't think you're going to get a much better response out of the pen. Of course, I'm just using very short words here, just to get everything out of the way. A full test might take quite a lot longer, but we'll see what we can do within a reasonable length of time. So this is the let's see, this is the L'Aubrac Masters of Meisterstruck. Seem to have messed up the order in which I'm doing them. We'll sort it out later. I feel like these pen, or at least this particular pen, the L'Aubrac, is writing a much thicker line than I'm used to with it. I don't know why. And then finally the tracing paper. for the sheet of birch bark. Of course, the birch bark is noteworthy because, well, it was used back before mass market paper was easily accessible, and also during periods of deprivation after the Second World War in certain settings. So going now to the Scipione Borghese pen, an absolutely magnificent pen. I've not used it as a daily carry, but we'll see. So this is actually the first time I've inked these pens in quite a while, so I'm quite confident that the ink we're using has not been diluted. I've noticed sometimes that I'll get a poor effect if I'm inking a pen immediately after changing the ink. So my handwriting is usually quite a bit smaller than this, but I'm having to adjust that because of the flow of the ink. It's worth noting that this tracing paper, of course, is not designed to receive ink, which means that it doesn't absorb the ink, but it does, well, it does take, therefore, a long time for the ink to dry, but it doesn't feather or bleed into the page. There you have it. That's cycling through all the pens and all the sheets of paper. So let's have a look at what we can conclude based on this rather hasty look at the various sheets. So we'll start with the birch bark because it's right at hand. So as you can see, the lines are very crisp and haven't bled at all. But what you can't tell from these tests, and one of the reasons why I'm not particularly keen on doing these types of tests, is that you can't feel what it's like to actually move the pen. So moving the pen over birch bark is quite strange, because there's quite a lot of resistance. So I imagine you'd use this on a regular basis. Your nib is going to clog quite quickly because it picks up the elements that are on the surface. But there you go, not much bleeding, and of course it's not going to bleed through at all. So now turning to Montblanc's special paper, their notebook. So there's not much difference between the Classique, Le Braque, and Limited Edition. They all have the same type of nib in terms of a medium nib, and it doesn't seem to have bled much through, but it has a little bit. So it's not as crisp a line as the Flex nib, which is the much thinner nib, but it is it's passable. So that hard start there was because I used the pen, or I had just used that pen. I hadn't tested it before, and it doesn't bleed through. But you can see, I guess, maybe against the light, you can see some of the writing on the other side. Now for Clairfontaine. So this is French paper that I use a lot. I like it. I don't know if it produces a line that is much different. It does take a bit longer to dry than generic paper, but I think it's worth it. So not too much of a difference between the $700 nib or $700 Classique pen and the 12,700 limited edition 888. Once again, because of the nibs, pretty much whatever you pay for the pen, the price of the pen, it all has to do with the decoration, the barrel, and basically everything other than the nib. The nibs are all pretty much equivalent, I'd say. So there, this is Clairfontaine. Not too bad. I'd say better than the Montblanc paper. And let's see. So the Rhodia was recommended to me by a colleague who's quite into paper. Uses fountain pens a lot as well. Pretty clean. Pretty clean. Maybe some bleeding in the thicker lines, and then you might find here at the top of the A one of the strands of paper. This paper has grains. One of the grains of paper seems to have allowed the ink to bleed through it just a little bit. So the Moleskine is probably what I use in the office, around the office, the most for personal notes, because it does make a nice notebook, and it does, I'm surprised to say, work well enough with the standard ink. I was expecting this to bleed a bit more, because sometimes it does, but I guess depending on the humidity levels that we've got in the area, it might make a difference. So that's the sheet from Moleskine. So now the Xerox, the general office paper you're going to find. So this is what you guys found somewhat disappointing, because it bled through, or was feathering. This is just, I don't see that. I don't see much of a difference between this and the Moleskine and the Rhodia. So maybe a little tiny bit of an effect, but I would say nothing that would stop me from using the generic Xerox paper or worry about using it. The color, I think, is also a bit more vivid, obviously because it's not a cream paper, it's just a nice white bleached paper. So now looking at the watercolor paper, I was expecting this to bleed a bit more. Actually, I don't see much at all, pretty much on the level of all the other papers. So because this is older paper, it's less prone to absorbing humidity. It's already about as humid as it's ever going to be in relative humidity. But yeah, so it's surprisingly well as well. Finally, the dollar roller paper. This is 200 grams, 220 grams per square meter. Not particularly designed for fountain pens, but performing well enough as well. Let's see, and then finally two more, the semi-gloss poster paper that is coated in, I think, calcium carbonate. That is by far the best result for the fountain pen. The crispest lines that I've seen, but you can see that the ink doesn't is not very homogeneous. So you've got some sections where the pen moved quickly and left less ink, and the ink that was thicker didn't travel down the line. So you don't have a very homogeneous line, which you would get on, let's say, any other type of paper where the ink tends to absorb back down the line that you've drawn. And then the tracing paper, this obviously takes the longest to dry because it's not expected to absorb ink. Does feather or bleed a little bit, but not particularly much. I think it's all dry by now. Yeah. Yeah. So there you have it. A test of several different types of paper, and a test of the most expensive and least expensive pen that I have in my collection at the moment. Thank you for watching, and if you've got any suggestions for what else I could do, or what else you'd like to see, let me know, and we'll see if we can get that worked out.